I'm going to talk about target consciousness, a term I coined over a decade ago, and we'll be focusing on how weaknesses in the pawn skeleton need to be noticed and utilized. Typical chess courses ask the chess student to rely on memorization, and though it's impossible to avoid a certain amount of memorization, I find that simple patterns and easy-to-grasp concepts make more sense, and with a bit of practice and introspection, will stay with you for life. Target consciousness pretty much explains itself. After you first learn what targets are, you then train your mind to always be on the lookout for them. You'll discover that over time, you'll automatically look for targets. Moreover, you'll eventually see them at a glance. So, what are targets? Simply put, they are weaknesses in the enemy camp that you would like to punish in some fashion. Punishment can be laying claim to a weak square or attacking a vulnerable pawn. This position is a great example of both kinds of weaknesses. Though white is down a pawn, black's in serious trouble since his b6 pawn and his d6 pawn can't be protected by another pawn, can't advance, and also don't have another pawn next to them that might help them advance. These are called backward pawns. Black's other problem is the weak squares on b5 and d5, also known as holes or support points, which can easily be occupied by white's knight and king. This, in turn, will allow white's pieces to penetrate into the enemy position. Let's take a look at a possible sequence. Everything starts with white recognizing all the things I just mentioned. And once you recognize the enemy weaknesses, finding the right moves is often shockingly easy. Since the targets are on b5 and d5, and the pawns on b6, d6, white starts off by rushing his king to one of those holes. King d3, f6. Black needs to get his king into the game to defend, and f6 allows king f7 so the king can head for the center. King c4. Of course, one glance shows you the superiority of white's king over black's pathetic king. Rook b8, defending the b6 pawn. Knight d5, putting pressure on it. Notice how powerful this knight is compared to the awful bishop on f8. King f7, king b5, bishop e7. Once again, black is doing nothing. White is completely dominating. The knight is powerful, the king is powerful, black's pieces are pathetic, white has no weaknesses, black is covered with weaknesses. And white decides to have a meal. Knight takes b6. There are many other ways to win, but if this works tactically. Bishop to d8. Black is hoping that he can get something going because now he's attacking this knight twice, and it's pinned. It can't run away. However, white can defend it by taking something else. Rook takes d6. The only good move, but it's a winner. King e7, rook e6 check, chasing him back to nowhere land, and now we take more stuff. And the game is over. You've just eaten all his pawns, and in the end, there's just no hope whatsoever for black. Weaknesses appear all the time in chess. In professional games, one side offers up a weakness so he himself can create a different weakness in the enemy camp. As Bobby Fischer once said, you've got to give squares to get squares. In other advanced games, weaknesses are painstakingly created by the use of small tactical nuances or deep positional maneuvering. In general, though, the side that has weaknesses created them himself. It's a form of unconscious self-immolation. The player hurts his own position, but is, of course, completely unaware that he's doing so. Let's have a look at a position that comes from the Filor defense, a black system that is very playable, but no longer popular. Here are 4 possible choices for black. 3 are terrible, while 1 is extremely logical. See if you can spot the best one while also understanding why the other 3 are inferior. Your choices are c6, e takes d4, knight takes d4, c5, the immediate c5, or g6. Take a long, serious look at these options and see which one you prefer. Only one of these moves is any good. The other three offer different levels of suicide. We'll explore each one. C6. This move lets Black's queen move to B6 or C7, but more importantly, it stops White from making use of the B5 and D5 squares. All these things are good additions to Black's position. A nice building move like C6 shows you that chess isn't really about making threats. Instead, you want to slowly build your position bit by bit, finding good squares for your pieces, depriving enemy pieces of squares, gaining space, etc. And when a violent battle finally occurs, you'll be on top, since your position will be one of strength, while your less accomplished opponent will be weighed down by various weaknesses he created in his own camp. E takes d4, knight takes d4, c5. This is awful. Of course, e takes d4 is fine, but this follow-up destroys the position. The problem is, by pushing the c-pawn, first it takes the square away from the knight, which could have used it at some point. But it does other horrible things too. It creates a gaping wound on b5. It creates a gaping wound on d5. And all it does is force the knight to a good square on f5 or even a good square on b5. You don't want to just attack pieces and hope that he just lets you take it. If you're going to push a pawn, make sure there's a reason and make sure that it actually does something to build your position and help your position, not create weaknesses inside your own camp. We have the immediate c5. Same problem. After d takes e5, d takes c5, we have a hole on d5 and we have a hole on b5. Why is Black giving up all these holes? He's actually creating them himself. And finally, g6. If you remember in past lectures, I've discussed the weaknesses on dark squares. By playing g6, you've created weaknesses on these dark squares. And White will immediately pounce with bishop h6, hitting the rook moves, knight to g5, hitting f7 with the bishop and the knight, and Black is lost, just lost right away. Another case of just creating weaknesses for no reason. So when push comes to shove and everything else is looked at, the best move was c6, giving the queen some room to move. Instead of creating holes, it's actually shoring up these squares and not allowing White to make use of them. Another form of weak pawn is the isolated pawn. This pawn is all by itself in that it doesn't have any friendly pawns on either side of it. To make matters worse, the square directly in front of it can easily fall into enemy hands since there's no pawn that can defend it. Though any kind of isolated pawn can be weak, if it's on an open file, it's particularly vulnerable since the rooks can take part in an overall assault against it. Black's pawn at e6 is isolated from its fellow pawns, and since it's on an open file, White's rooks are hammering it. If Black had a pawn on f7, it would be solidly protected. But now it just stands alone, with its minor and heavy pieces doing babysitting chores. As a result, White can heap on the pressure with a move like bishop to g4. When White's queen, rooks, and bishop all hit e6, have a look at this convergence. All these pieces hammering that one point, while Black is just sitting passively, trying to hold on as best he can. Of course, an isolated pawn can also be a positive thing. For example, it could be an advanced pass pawn, a topic we explored in our last lecture, or it could be a central pawn on the fourth rank, meaning it's grabbing central space and taking aim at some important squares, which might allow a knight to sit happily on an advanced post. In this position, the d4 pawn, though isolated, is well protected by the f3 knight, the queen, and the rook on d1. Since it's the most advanced central pawn for either side, it gains central space, offers the f3 knight a nice home on e5, and eventually might help crack the center open with a d4 to d5 advance. If you are facing a dynamic isolated pawn like the position we just looked at, or a less threatening isolated pawn, here's a formula that will allow you to turn it into a pure weakness. Control the square in front of the isolated pawn. d5 is the key square here. Make sure you control this square in front of this isolated pawn. This stops the pawn from advancing. Therefore, you're fixing its location, and that allows you ultimately to not only put pressure on it, but it's also a very nice home for a knight or a bishop or eventually maybe even a rook. So, in our effort to dominate this d-pawn, we first gained total control over the d5 square. Now, we want to trade all the minor pieces because the point of the d-pawn was to gain central space and build up an attacking position. But if you don't have pieces, there's no attack, and therefore it's just a weakness. So, after dominating the d5 square, you want to trade all the minor pieces, all the attacking pieces. And that way, you can now just eye this weakness with total safety. Your king will be safe. The other thing you want to do after that is you want to retain a queen and a rook. By keeping the queen, you scare the enemy king so it can't come out and defend this d4 pawn. And by the rook, you're allowed to stop the pawn by putting the rook on d5 and then doubling on it and putting tremendous pressure on this pawn. By doing so, you stop the pawn from advancing. Now it's a sitting duck. It's frozen. Once you do that, it's frozen, helpless, and you can start chipping away at it. This will force the isolated pawn's owner to fall into a pure defensive position. Notice the incredible pressure placed against d4. If you've successfully blocked the pawn and created a pin along the isolated pawn's file, which we have here, then push the adjacent pawn so it attacks the target, which is d4. Due to the pin, meaning that white can't take because he would hang his rook, you will finally win the isolated pawn. I know this seems complicated, but once you look at the picture-perfect example I'm about to show you, you'll realize that all these things are, with a little repetitive study, easily understood and very, very doable. We just looked at some cases of how to deal with an isolated d-pawn. Now we're going to show you how it works in real practice. This time, black is the one with the d-pawn. I created the anti-isolated pawn formula in the mid-70s for my students, but I wasn't able to make full use of it until I faced off against a strong master from Brazil. Black has active pieces, a safe king, and an easy development. Also, notice that the isolated d-pawn, which is here, isn't under any pressure at all. One would think that black is doing really well, and I have to admit that he's okay. But white's the one with the chances if he follows the formula. Knight to g5. Now, this looks like I'm going to attack him on the king side, but that's nothing to do with it, anything. What I'm really after is trading the minor pieces. White already controls the square in front of the isolated pawn. So now it's time to make these trades and strip the minor pieces away from both sides. The main form of compensation for the isolated d-pawn is active minor pieces. To put it bluntly, if you trade the minor pieces, they can't be active. In that case, the isolated d-pawn can easily turn out to be a pure weakness. Black traded, queen takes, and then he made a mistake. And he traded again, just what white wants. Bishop takes, knight f5, queen d3. Of course, he can't take even if he wanted to here because of mate. So the knight's pinned for a moment, but that's no big deal. He just chases my knight away, but I'm very happy to bring it back. And he brings his rook to the middle. White would be delighted if black captured this bishop. Once again, we're trying to trade minor pieces, so if black wants to do it for us, all the better. And you just take your time. We bring a rook towards the middle. Our rook and queen is kind of eyeing this d5 pawn, and you just have to be patient and build. Black trades a rook. He switches his knight over to a better square, and now we just improve again. By playing g3, we blunt this bishop, and we give our king a comfortable place to step to. The knight comes around. King g2, just tightening the position. There's no hurry whatsoever. Rook e8. He's trying to trade the rooks. White would still be a little better if you did so. However, remember the formula. We really want to keep a queen and a rook, if possible. So, we refuse the trade. Queen e6. I do it a different way, just making the guy suffer and taking the time, and then I stop the trade in another manner by blocking the file. Rook d8, and now I put pressure again. So now there's pressure on d5. He has to keep defending it. Notice that he has no attack whatsoever because of the limited amount of minor pieces. Queen e7, and I trade more. Black really shouldn't allow this trade. It's still going to be better for white, but not a good idea. Instead, he took. Queen takes. The guy gets the pawn off this black square, and now the final part of our strategy, bishop f4, forcing the exchange of the final minor piece. Bishop takes, queen takes, and here we are with our formulaic position. All the minor pieces are gone, only a queen and a rook are left for each side, and now that pawn is going to be battered. Queen c5. And now, just like that formula, we bring the rook in front of the pawn so the pawn can never advance. We've frozen it. Queen c6, we go back. Now, we're putting tremendous pressure. And if he's not careful, we'll go c4 at some point and win the pawn because of the pin on that file. So, black pushes this b pawn to stop that c4, c3, c4 advance. White's king just steps back for a moment. Queen g6. We protect this pawn. Notice it's unprotected, and at some point the queen might come in here with a check and win that pawn. So we just put all our pieces and pawns on safe squares. Once again, there is no rush. Black's helpless. You just torture him. And the more you torture somebody, the weaker they become and they eventually make mistakes. King f8. I just gain a little more space and a little more king room. Queen b1 check, king g2. He's just going back and forth. He can't really do anything. And now it's time to create another weakness. So I play a4, queen e6, capture, capture. And now suddenly there's two targets, b5 and d5. Queen d3. So now I'm hitting d5, and my queen is now hitting b5. And it becomes more and more difficult for black. And black now just kind of caves. He needed to hold on with queen c6 and just pray that he can survive, but it's not very good. And also he was afraid that my queen would come right into his position, which I probably would have done, and that wouldn't have been overly nice for him either. So in any case, he decided to give up a pawn. He's just cracking in every way. So what he did was play g6 to keep me out of his position. I grabbed a pawn, make some random move, queen d3, and I keep beating on this pawn. You just don't stop. And the game is coming to the end. He plays a move. I could just take my time and eventually do the c4 move, but tactically I can do it right off, and so I do. c4, and because of the pin, he's losing more material, and the game is over, and black resigned a few moves later. We saw how weak an isolated pawn can be, but imagine if you had one isolated pawn on top of another. This is called a doubled pawn. Black is a far superior pawn structure thanks to white's doubled b pawns, which unfortunately are on an open file. The general rule when attacking doubled pawns is to target the lead pawn since it's closer to your army and thus easier to reach with less enemy pieces buzzing about. Black plays rook A, B8, just hitting this guy. Now the bishop's hitting it, the rook's hitting it. White is already losing material. So he comes to the file. Black gobbles a pawn. And if white checks, all you have to do is just block it. You're happy to trade, and you have an extra pawn. And on top of that, the other pawn is weak too. And so this position is lost for white. Let's look at the same position, but this time we'll remove all the rooks. One would think that without the rooks, maybe the pawn is safer, but no. The problem is that black's king can just leisurely walk over, end up on b5, and go after that pawn. White still has serious problems since black's king will take a leisurely stroll to b5 and chop off the b4 pawn. So the game might go king c7. The king comes up, but notice how he can't move anywhere. All these squares are covered, so the king really can't advance for white. Black just calmly heads towards the target. The pawn in front, the pawn that's the lead pawn in the doubled pawns, always the weakest. King b5, and it's over. You're just going to take this pawn, a free pawn, and go on to win the game. Notice how black's king was able to comfortably take up shop on b5. That's because double isolated pawns aren't just weak in themselves, but also leave a hole on the square in front of them. In fact, in many instances, the square is far more important than the weakness of the pawns. e4, c5, knight f3, knight c6, d4, c takes d4, knight takes. A typical Sicilian defense position. Knight f6, knight c3, d6, bishop e3. So far, nothing special. But now, something changes quite drastically. Knight g4 hitting the bishop, and white decides to allow the doubling of his pawns for development. Black chops it off, and now we have doubled isolated pawns. But we're not going to so much pay attention to the isolated pawns as weaknesses as much as the square in front. Notice that no pawn can chase anything on e5 away. So black makes use of that lovely square instantly. Also notice that the knight on e5 hits the bishop and also guards the f7 point. The bishop retreats, and black prepares to fianchetto his bishop. The point being that on g7, that g7 bishop will add to the protection of that key square on e5. White castles, bishop to g7. Now we completely own the e5 square. Knight to d5, castles. Take a close look at the relative positions of white's d5 knight and black's e5 knight. Both are advanced and look quite threatening. And one might think that white's knight is even happier than black, since it's deeper into the opponent's camp than the e5 knight is. But that's not the case. The difference between the d5 and e5 squares is that black's knight can't be chased away by an enemy pawn thanks to the immobility of the doubled isolated pawns. But white's knight can be kicked away at any time with pawn to e6. Thus, d5 isn't a hole, while e5 is. Black already has the superior position and went on to win the game. Taking our doubled pawn concept and stretching it to absurdity, let's glance at something the English call the Irish pawn center, a snide term for tripled pawns. I often wonder if the Irish call it the English pawn center. This isn't seen very often, and when it does occur, it's a very bad thing in the vast majority of cases. This one example will suffice to show you just how terrible this can be. Material's even, but black should resign, since all three of black's queenside pawns are stopped cold by white's one little pawn on b3. On the other hand, white's free-range kingside pawns are ready to march up the board, and it doesn't take more than a glance to see that black's lonely G7 pawn won't be able to stop them. For example, King F6, F4, King E6, G5, King F7, F5. Black's just going back and forth. And white can simply just march up and devour these pawns. And if the king tries to come over to the other side, then white will just make a queen on the king's side. So it's just hopeless. Basically, it's like being down 2 pawns. So, are doubled and tripled pawns always a liability? Well, triple pawns are pretty bad, but the acquisition of doubled pawns actually has a place in advanced chess strategy, especially if the doubled pawns are not isolated. Here's a simple but quite common example. The position isn't particularly exciting. None of the rooks have an open file, and both sides seem to have a firm grip on the d5 and d4 squares. White's next move tries to change the status quo. Remember, just because there isn't a file for your rooks doesn't mean you can't create one. White plays bishop to e3. White is actually begging black to give him doubled pawns. Why would anyone want to do such a thing? Black says, okay, I'll give you doubled pawns. And white takes back. And suddenly the boring position has changed to something far more interesting. A moment ago, black had control over the d4 square. Now, thanks to the pawn on e3, it's a forbidden square. A moment ago, all the rooks were staring at their own pawns. Now the f-file is half open, and the f1 rook is dreaming of heroic adventures. And what does white have to thank for all of this? The doubled pawns. Isolated pawns can be both good and bad at the same time, with the result depending on how well you make use of the thing you have. Even doubled pawns have pluses and minuses, and while all those structural anomalies are looming large, tactics, positional concepts, king safety, and who knows what else are crashing together and creating something that looks more like a Dali painting than the logical landscape that it actually is. We'll finish with a position that features several things we've discussed, here and in earlier lectures. Black owns the open c-file, but is it useful or is it a road to nowhere? White has doubled isolated d-pawns, but are these weak or are they useful? Black has a backward pawn on e7, and white has doubled his rooks on the e-file so he can place them under maximum pressure. Also notice that black has 2 holes in his camp, one on c6 and the other on e6. Finally, here are 2 more points. White's pawns on d5 and d4 and f4 give him more space, and white's pieces are obviously more actively placed than black's. That's a lot of stuff to chew on during a game, but when you realize that white's double d-pawns are gobbling up space, taking the c5 square away from black's pieces, and also claiming the c6 and e6 holes for white, it quickly becomes obvious who is in charge. And this teaches us an important chess truth. All the things that are usually viewed as negatives in chess sometimes put on a white hat and turn into the game's heroes. White, wanting to loosen up black's king and also activate his bishop, played g4 and went on to win. Here's an entertaining variation. F takes g4, bishop takes g4. Suddenly, this bishop is extremely active, and of course, it's attacking black's rook. The rook moves to safety, and white cracks the king's side, trying to get at black's king. g5, try to keep it closed. And now the knight takes up a nice home on e4. Complete domination. All of white's pieces are far superior to black's, which are lingering on the back rank. Knight d7, queen c6. White would love it if black captured this queen and gave white this monster passed pawn. So black said, no, I can't allow that, and he got out of the way. Knight takes d6. This is crushing because if he takes, you're just winning material. So this doesn't really work. So he retreated and played rook f8, but he's just lost a pawn. And now white crashes through. Rook takes e7 check, sacrificing the exchange, captures with check, and now we want to get our queen over to the king side. Notice this line would be open and you're going to checkmate him. So the knight has to be tossed out of the way. There's several ways to do this. One good way is the strange knight f7. Rook takes f7, check, king h8, and rook takes f7. And after this, there's no way to stop either queen g7 mate or queen h7 mate, and so the game ends. The eternal hunt for weaknesses in the pawn skeleton, while also avoiding such weaknesses in your own pawn structure, is one of the major catalysts to true chess proficiency. If you make a major effort to cultivate target consciousness, you'll find that you'll be head and shoulders above the vast majority of players you'll ever face. After you beat your less knowledgeable opponents time and time again, they will claim you're lucky, or they're having an off day, or any number of other excuses. When this happens, smile, agree that you are indeed lucky, and then beat them again.